decided best that the church and the state are separated. What that doesn't mean is that it is best that religion plays no public role. What it does mean is that the church as an institution does not have control over the levers of power. And that's a lesson that made perfect sense in the context of Western history. Now, if you're talking to the Muslim world and you say separate church and state, you run into a problem in that there is no church. There is no church in the Islamic tradition, particularly in the Sunni tradition, which is the majority expression. That is, you don't have a religious institution that speaks by divine right. There is, strictly speaking, in the Islamic tradition, no orthodoxy. What there is orthopraxy. That is, there are practices that everybody adopts that are uniform. So you can go to a mosque anywhere in the world and they will be praying exactly the same way, always in Arabic. I'm talking about formal prayers, not every form of worship, but that is uniform. But orthodoxy doesn't exist. So the people performing these rituals exactly the same way have different thoughts, they have different theologies, and it's the fact that there is an orthopraxy that allows the community to exist in the presence of a lack of orthodoxy, a lack of doctrine that is necessarily shared by everybody. What that means is, in the context of the Islamic tradition, there is no one who can articulate official theology. It just isn't. It's a perpetual conversation. Political authorities may try to stop that from time to time, but no political authority in the Islamic tradition has divine authority. That is, you can't really have a theocracy. So when you say separate church and state to somebody who lives within the Islamic tradition, it's not so much that they have to take a position on whether or not they agree with that. It actually doesn't compute. You don't have the same institutional architecture. You can have religious people or religious authorities trying to influence the public sphere, but they don't have a divine right to be obeyed. And if you look at classical Islamic history, what you don't have is a theocracy. The clerical class, and even cleric's a problematic word, I'll use it. The clerical class really played the role that I guess academics or media play in our society. They had an influential role. They did not hold the levers of government. And the caliphs could do what they want with their power, but they had no religious authority. If you look at medieval Islamic texts, what you don't find is here is what the caliphs did, and therefore this is what Islamic law is. Islamic law is something that exists as an abstract theoretical idea, and whether or not the caliphs responded to it was a matter for them. Add to that, the second dimension, which is the problem that I found in the discourse about Iraq, was even if we leave aside the problems with using secularism as a concept to understand the Muslim world, let's assume we can use it. Why do you think people in Iraq would want to vote in a secular regime? Understand that our attraction in the West to secularism stems very much from our grisly history of theocracy. Now, when you say secular to someone in Iraq, they think Saddam Hussein, who was a staunch secularist. And when you say religious governance to someone in Iraq, they think of the golden age of Islamic civilization when Baghdad was a capital at various points. It's the proudest point in their history. And poll after poll in the Muslim world, particularly in places that have secular government, or had, like Iraq or Egypt now, the response you get is we would actually like more religion in government because religion acts as a restraint on what the ruler can do. That is, it makes them accountable to something, a set of standards. Whereas under a secular regime, there are no limits. They can do whatever they want. They're just autocrats. Now that sounds absurd to us, but recognise that they are being a product of their history in precisely the same way that we are a product of ours. It's just that the solutions may be opposite. And this was an example, I think, of how the conversation just goes like this, because you have a whole lot of commentators in the West saying, well, just secularise, that's the path to freedom. And a whole lot of people in the Muslim world either saying, I don't know what you even mean by that. Or if they do, if they actually accept the assumptions embedded in secularism as a term, have a totally different history and say, why do you think we would want that? Now, the final point, secularism, or the idea of secular parties being in control in Iraq, is a lot more popular now than it was a few years ago. Why? Because they've had the experience of religious political authority and the way that that can damage the fabric of society, particularly the way it's operated in Iraq recently, which just demonstrates that they too are just a product of their history as well.
So should we be, moving that on then, should we be talking about the type of Islamic influence of individuals who form a government rather than the institution of a church based around Islam?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that a qualitative issue, that you can have some extreme positions of individuals who also have an Islamic doctrine, an interpretation of Islamic doctrine, and all that that entails? Isn't that part of the issue?
And I agree, that's entirely the point. But the point to make is not to focus on whether or not they are speaking religiously or not. It's to focus on whether or not what they propose is good.
And just to add on to that, how important was it? You mentioned here about the Crusades, the attack on Muslims, and of course the Crusades, the Christians were promised redemption and eternal delight in heaven when they killed Muslims, and that was the case in the Crusades. How important was it, the rhetoric that was used by the US President George Bush saying there was a crusade against the Islamic world? And how did that resonate? I mean, given that history, you would expect that that would have been a profound and heartfelt type arrangement.
It wasn't a hit.
It wasn't a hit.
At least not in a good way. People in the Muslim world and in the Muslim communities still talk about it. Like the concept of the war on terror, especially being a crusade, frames the entire experience for millions of people. And so you need to understand that when you're assessing the way they respond to these things. Now, President Obama frames it differently, and that's having some impact, but nonetheless it's an issue. But I just want to make one really quick and interesting point.